Good evening. Welcome to class number 5 on Essential Christian Apologetics. Welcome back to WITS. Yeah. All right, let's pray. Well, Father, as always, we just thank you for a multitude of your blessings, Lord God. They're so innumerable, so unimaginably good to us, Lord God. We just can't even begin to describe it. We just thank you for our opportunity, Lord, to learn again about who you are, looking, as your word says, at creation, looking at just the way that you've built and designed us, Lord. And we just pray that you would be here in our midst again tonight, Lord God, as we would turn our hearts and minds and attention to you. We welcome you here. Guide us and lead us and teach us by the power of your Spirit. And we just want to submit our hearts to you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So we are essentially, done with the whole sciencey chapter. So for those who are really like, wow, that's not where I was. It's been a long time since I've been in science class. It's important, though, and we're going to a couple of more things to finish here this evening, and then we'll move on into another really fascinating topic, which is the moral law. So if you're reading along with us, we'll talk about the moral law. But the reason the science stuff, and again, the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, is just barely kind of scratches the surface, and they kind of scratch a couple of itches that are maybe not necessarily the ones I would look at. But it's super important because I think that's what most people who reject God, reject the Bible, reject Christianity, tend to fall back on and say, hasn't science disproven the Bible? And what we find is the exact opposite seems to be really the case, is that science confirms the Bible, at least good science does, and bad science does damage to itself and reveals itself to be another false religion rather than actual pursuit of wisdom and facts. So I got a few quotes that'll go along with that. And then if we have time at the end of tonight, before it gets to the bottom at 8:30, I've got a short, 8-minute video I was going to show you from YouTube, and I'm going to turn off the live stream so we can kind of do that for those of you here. And for those who are online, I can send you the YouTube video link if you want to watch it yourself. So we'll get to that later, assuming I can get through the material notes for tonight. So this, and before we even get into that, I'll just say we're in chapter 7 of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, which is the moral law, the title, Mother Teresa versus Hitler. Yeah, I'll talk about that. And then we'll jump, presumably, I didn't bring the notes for tonight, but presumably when we finish that tonight, we'll jump over into the C.S. Lewis Mere Christianity, look at the first section of Mere Christianity, which deals with the understanding or the presence that seems to be, seems to be part of every person's existence. So we'll see some of that here today. I tried to strip out almost all of the C.S. Lewis Mere Christianity quotes from this section, although there's still some in there because it's kind of relevant to the flow of content. But then we'll look at the Mere Christianity that'll give us deeper dive look at this moral law. Can we deny its existence or not? And then if we can't, then it points to a moral lawgiver and all of the things that go along with that. But before we do that, let me just point you to a couple of quotes. These are my favorites. If you've been in any one of my classes over the last 4 or 5, 10 years, you probably have seen some of these before. But let me just highlight a few of them again. And there's hundreds of them like this out there. These are just the ones I've collected and tend to put on. So I title this section, What Does Science Have to Say for Itself? Dr. George Wald, who was a professor of biology at Harvard a number of decades ago, said this: one has to only contemplate the magnitude of the task, speaking of evolution, to concede that spontaneous generation, abiogenesis, from non-life to life, of living organisms is impossible. Yet I choose to believe that which I know to be impossible rather than accept the unthinkable, special creation. Right? He also says this: when it comes to the origin of life, there are only 2 possibilities: creation or spontaneous generation. There is no third way. Spontaneous generation was disproved 100 years ago, but that leads us to only one other conclusion, that of supernatural creation. We cannot accept that on philosophical grounds. Therefore, we choose to believe the impossible, that life arose spontaneously by chance. And we have this from Robert Jastrow, who was the founder of the Goddard Space Institute at NASA. So he says this: the scientist's pursuit of the past ends at the moment of creation, first cause. We cannot get past that to answer any questions. This is an exceedingly strange development, unexpected by all but the theologians. They have always accepted the words of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. For the scientist who has lived by faith in evolution and reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He's about to conquer the highest peak, and he pulls himself over the final rock. He is greeted there by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. He's not a Christian. He's not a believer. He has no faith in God, but you can see where he understands the evidence leads to the conclusion. John Walton, a little bit more recent quote here, John Walton, a chemist, said this: the origin of the genetic code, remember we've looked at the DNA, the genetic code, all the complexities that go into that. But he's talking about the genetic code as far as information. So the origin of the genetic code presents formidable unsolved problems. The coded information in the nucleotide sequence is meaningless without the translation machinery. But the specification for this machinery is coded in the DNA. Thus, without the machinery, the information is meaningless. But without the coded information, the machinery cannot be produced. This presents a paradox of the chicken and egg variety, and attempts to solve it have so far been sterile. And they still are. Okay. The possibility, I quoted this so many times I don't have to do it anymore for you, but the possibility of life arising by chance is about the same as the possibility of a tornado sweeping through a junkyard could assemble a Boeing 747 from the contents therein. That was Fred Hoyle. His calculation after trying to attempt to calculate how spontaneous generation come about, from a single cell, he got to 10 to the 40,000th power. Remember, there's only 10 to the 80th atoms in the universe. So 40,000th power of zeros is way, 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 way bigger than the number of atoms that they project are, contained in the universe. Perspective, if we happen to live, let's say, in a 15 billion year old universe, so far we've really only experienced about 10 to the 18th seconds, 10 with 18 zeros after it. He's calculated that for a cell to begin the process of forming from non-life to life would be 10 to the 40,000th power. It's actually, the perspective is winning a state lottery is about 10 to the 7th power, 10 with 7 zeros after it. So what seems more probable? You going out and buying a lottery ticket and winning the state lottery, or life coming around by chance? That's what drove him to that conclusion. Winning the state lottery every week for 1,000 years by chance would be 10 to the 80th power. But a secular, materialist biologist comes to the conclusion that to get life from non-life, it's 10 to the 40,000th power. And I've also quoted Richard Dawkins a couple times before as well. He says, I have no explanation for complex biological design. All I know is that God isn't a good explanation. So we must wait and hope that somebody comes up with a better one. There's your committed to the truth scientist. He also says this: the appearance of design. Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. They give the appearance of being designed, but they're really super complicated, but don't actually exhibit design whatsoever. So I always like, make sure you kind of catch that. These are real-life testimonies from real-life atheists who can't seem to get around the fact that their conclusions can't escape that what we live in is a very purposeful and designed universe and existence. Yeah, science talking to us. All right, so with that, we'll move into chapter 7 of Mother Teresa versus Hitler in our study in the, again, what we've been going through here is this trying to strip away all presuppositions, trying to start at the basic ground level and say, what is believable about the world we live in and what is just bluster by people who have an opinion but don't have facts to back it up, right? And so we looked at philosophy and found that, no, I think you really can't understand truth. I think truth is discoverable. I think that would be It's only in a philosophical desire to eliminate truth can you eliminate truth. Really, you can't eliminate truth by just thinking that truth doesn't exist. And then we looked at, again, I'll use these terms. They're classical in their presentation. The cosmological argument, meaning the universe clearly exhibits by scientific discovery having a beginning, and a beginning demands something began it, a beginner. We looked at the teleological argument, which means looking at the past. And so, meaning what we're at now, we're, in my estimation, 6,000 years from the moment of creation. We look at the end of it and we say, gosh, this universe sure seems to be well designed and purposeful. And the more technology we get to drill deeper and deeper and deeper into the cells and further and further and further into outer space and wherever else we look, it's not getting easier to understand, it's getting harder to understand. I don't remember if I probably did, quoted this. I came across an article about 2 months ago. They've got the Hadron Super Collider for atoms and all that kind of stuff. They've been trying to smash them into each other at incredibly high speeds to kind of pull them apart and see what's going on in there. And one of these physicists who's been studying the atom for most of his career, and they continue to advance and advance and advance in this. He wrote an article that said the atom is the most complicated thing on the planet. It's far more complicated than anything anybody's ever seen. Most people can never imagine how complicated it is. And of course, it's the basic building blocks of everything. Stars and cells and everything is an atom. And it's not easy to explain its existence. It's incredibly difficult. We can't even understand it after decades of exploding atoms and trying to look inside of them. All we're coming to the point is we have something very complex. Okay, so now we're talking about what we ultimately would call a third or fourth line of argument here, and that is the moral law. And this one is not as, mathematic-y, not science-y. It's just dealing with the reality of what we can actually perceive about the one piece of equipment we have more insight into than anything else, and that's the human existence, right? We can observe orangutans and we can observe stars out in the heavens, but we really, have a better chance of understanding humanity than we do anything else in this existence. And so we're going to look at the moral law. Does it exist? Does it not exist? So the first question that is posed for us to consider, is there a standard? If there's no moral objective standard, then life is nothing more than a glorified Monopoly game, is the analogy used by our authors here. So whatever you acquire in this life, when you die, goes back in the box for somebody else to acquire after you die, right? There's just one considered. There's just nothing else. You live, you do whatever you do, you're not accountable for anything, you don't gain anything, you just put everything that you earned or whatever happened in your life back in the Monopoly box, and somebody else plays the game after you. But the second point is, why, genuinely ask yourself this question, why do most human beings seem to have the same intuitive sense that they ought to do good and shun evil? Now notice it doesn't say all. There's some very, very immoral people out there who seem to have a seared conscience, cannot even determine what is right or wrong. But I think we'll even discover that most of those who seem to have this seared conscience, they still have some sort of a moral standard that they live by. It's only very corrupted, but they still have it. And a lot of times I'll use this, like, not that I've really, per se, other than former, I've never met, and had conversations with actual current gang members. I've had a couple of conversations in the last month with a couple of different ones that we used to be, and that they're not Christians. But gang members, they don't mind killing, they don't mind stealing from one another and do all these things, but boy, don't steal from me. Don't lie to me, we do everything wrong out there, but, they hold everybody in their gang has to come under the authority of that gang leader, or there's hell to pay, right? Because they expect a moral standard even within their own code of system of how they operate. So why do most humans have something in them that seems to shun evil and understand that they really, even if they don't do it, they ought to have done something good in response to whatever stimuli you have? So there's a hypothesis here, and we've seen this kind of syllogism again that we've looked at before, and this is just, a premise and all that. So there's a hypothesis here that there really is a moral law that has been written on our hearts. That's the hypothesis. No one's asking anybody to accept the hypothesis without investigation first. So here's the premise that helps to fuel the content of this chapter. Premise number one, every law has a lawgiver. If you go into Washington, D.C., or into Olympia, Washington, or whatever, and you pull out the codes, all the statutes, you go, here's a code. It was written 150 years ago. Did it come from nowhere, or did somebody write it? Right? Every law has a lawgiver. There is a moral law. That's a premise, not a conclusion, not a fact at this point. But if these two premises are true, then there must be a moral lawgiver. That's what we're going to explore here. That's not, like I said, a statement you must accept without investigation. It's just a statement this is what we're going to explore. Is there really a moral law, and is there really, therefore, a moral lawgiver based on the evidence that we have? So we can see some of these things in our own language, even by people who don't necessarily hold to any type of Christian or religious value. But we even go to our own Declaration of Independence from 1776, and it states that the moral law is self-evident. Okay, it says we find these truths to be self-evident, right? And then it begins to state this. I don't need to appeal to the King of England. I don't need to appeal to the Catholic Pope. I don't need to appeal to any other human agency. I just say it's self-evident to every human being that these laws, the pursuit of freedom and life and liberty and happiness and all of that, is a self-evident claim that humanity appeals to. Also, number two, without an objective standard of meaning and morality, then life itself is meaningless. There is absolutely nothing right or absolutely nothing wrong if you don't have a moral law. Everything's just a matter of opinion. And why should one person or one group of people's opinion, trump somebody else's? Is there some kind of analogy there that democracy is two wolves and a lamb deciding what to eat for dinner, right? It's you've got a vote, everybody votes, let's eat the lamb for dinner. That's democracy. Is that a matter of personal opinion? Is there something associated with, that says what's right and what's wrong as opposed to just the majority rules and this category of thought? So the moral law, if there is one, is demonstrated by the observation that all people seem to be impressed with a fundamental sense of right and wrong, even if most, nearly all at some point in time in their life, ignore it. Okay? But compare these kind of just super easy statements. Love is superior to hate. Who stands up and argues that hate is a superior action or motive or feeling than love? What grounds do they have to make such a claim? Okay? Love seems to be superior to hate, and most human beings accept that love is a better response than hate. Courage is better than cowardice. If the whole world were filled with nothing but cowards, where would we be? Everybody, or if you had 99% cowards and 1% aggressive, willing by hostile forces to go and take everything from the cowards, you would have 1% of the population not just seeming to own everything, they would own everything. Yeah. Letter C. So there is no land, think as far back in history as you like, look around the world at all the 2,000 or whatever countries and nations we have on this planet. There is no land, no nation where murder is considered a virtue and gratitude towards other things and other people being a vice. Why are you so grateful? That's disgusting to me. Who says that? Right? Where do we find somebody going, your gratitude is just deplorable to me? Why don't you go out and murder somebody? That's the right thing to do. Can you imagine this being a society or a nation's standard? It doesn't make any sense, does it? Everyone knows there are absolute moral obligations that are binding on all people at all times and all places. But how can this be? Especially if we're bags of chemicals that evolved out of the goo through the zoo to us. Why is it that all people seem to understand there are indeed moral absolutes that are always binding? So, then, if it seems we have this perception, how do we know the moral law exists? Okay. First off, really, we can say, the first claim, and you can try to work your way through it, but the moral law is undeniable. Number two, or letter B here, is we know it by our reactions, and it really forms the basis for all claims to human rights. We'll explore all this as we go. Okay. It is the moral law would seem to be the unchanging standard of justice, right? Murder is wrong. Love is better than hate, those kind of things. It defines a real difference between various moral positions that any person, group of people, or nation might take. And since we know what is absolutely wrong, like the title of the book here, or title of the chapter, Hitler, since we know that this is absolutely wrong, to kill 70 million Jews or whatever it is in the Holocaust, right? It's absolutely wrong to do that. Then it must reveal to us there is an absolute standard of rightness which all people inherently know. You don't need to convince anybody that murdering tens of millions of people is wrong. Obviously, somebody thought it was okay to do it, but we'll talk about that. Why would Hitler or Mao or anybody else think, well, it's okay to do it? There are justifications that people come up with, but it's always a justification as to why they don't have to be bound by the moral law. It's not a denial of the moral law. So the moral law is the basis for political and social dissent. Like if you want to stand up and say this is wrong, you shouldn't do this, my taxes are too high, your intrusion into my family life is wrong, you're permitting gender change in reassignment surgeries or whatever is wrong. You've got to have a basis for making some kind of claim, or even the opposite of that. So if the moral law did not exist, then here's the big point. We wouldn't make excuses for violating it. What you find is, right, somebody's late to work. Well, I mean, not that that's a major moral thing, but there's always a reason, right? They don't just go, well, your standard is wrong, right? If I cut you off in traffic, it's, well, I had to get home, I was in a hurry, right? I have some excuse, right? If I broke into your house and stole from you, well, you have no idea how much my kids need a new set of shoes, right? There's an excuse that goes along with getting caught for breaking some moral standard. It's never just, your standards are wrong. It's my property, not yours. You don't see that. And we even hear that today with some of the critical race theory and all that stuff that's going on. They're just saying, after hundreds of years of being oppressed, it's now ours. They're still appealing against a moral law. They're not saying the moral law doesn't exist when we see these kind of actions. So, let's deal with this. The moral law is undeniable. That's a claim. Let's see if we can't support that. If there really is no absolute truth, then a claim that there is no absolute truth cannot be true. This goes back to our Roadrunner tactic in our first or second chapter, right? So, people will make some claim. There's no absolute moral law. Is that absolutely true, that there's no moral absolutes, right? You begin to just ask that same question. So in an irrational claim that there's no such thing as a moral law or no absolutes is itself irrational, and they're attempting to deny what they're trying to affirm what they're attempting to deny, or using an affirmation to deny something that they are trying to claim. So relativists, here we kind of by example here, relativists, the people who believe in relative moral opinions and whatnot, are absolutely sure, circle that point, absolutely sure there are no absolutes, which of course is illogical, right? Everything is relative. Is everything relative a relative statement or an absolute statement? Right? It's an absolute statement trying to claim everything is relative. Absolute values are undeniable. The man who denies the existence of values actually values his right to deny absolute values and desires for people to value him for his views. And did anybody bring the book tonight? I don't have enough. Can I borrow it? Because I was going to pack it and I put it in my bag. Can I borrow that? Oh, thanks. I want to read this one quote here from Norman. Boy, I wish I would have been in some situations with him a few times. Let me just read the section here. So page 173. He's in a situation where he's talking to some people at a like school board meeting or something, I think it is. So he says this. He says, like absolute truth, absolute values are also undeniable. While the claim there are no absolute values is not self-defeating, the existence of absolute value is practically undeniable for the person who denies all values, values his right to deny them. Further, he wants everyone to value him as a person, even when he denies that there are no values for persons. Here's the point. This was illustrated clearly a number of years ago when I, Norm, was speaking to a group of affluent, well-educated Chicago suburbanites. After I suggested that there are things as objective moral values to which we all have an obligation, one lady stood up and protested loudly, "There are no real values. It's all a matter of taste or opinion." I resisted the temptation to make my point by shouting, "Sit down and shut up, you egghead. Who wants to hear your opinion?" Of course, if I had been so rude and discourteous, she would have rightly complained that I had violated her right to her opinion and her right to express it. To which I could have replied, "You have no such right. You just told me such rights don't exist." I wish I could think that fast. So, telling a person who says there are no such things as right and wrong, they're all a matter of opinion, to sit down and shut up to someone who denies the reality that these things exist would certainly generate a response. Can you imagine anybody not responding or reacting to someone telling them in a board-type meeting or whatever, "Sit down and shut up"? They're probably going to be enraged. Why? Why are they enraged if they tell me that there's no such thing as a moral standard? I have just as much right to say it or as not to say it. So, this tells us that our reactions help to discover the existence of the moral law. We recognize all people fail to keep the moral law, but it's our reactions, like a woman who claims there's no such thing as a moral standard, getting upset when you call her an egghead. Right? How about an outrage of a relativist student? Somebody says there are no absolutes, everything's relative, and he writes a paper for his college paper, and he gets an F on his college paper for no reason other than the professor just said, "I felt like giving you an F." It's all relative. What's he going to do, right? He's going to say, "I worked hard on that paper. I spent hours over my weekend. I start writing that paper. I put a lot of effort into it to tell the whole world that everything is relative." And the professor says, "You're right. You convinced me. Everything is relative. Take your F and go home." Because what's the point of giving you an A if everything is relative? The student, how many think the student is going to be in any way accepting that the relative position he holds should be continued through his grade system? Not going to happen. He believes that his hard work should be rewarded for obeying the standards and the syllabus of the class and how to get a good grade, even though he's asserting some kind of ridiculous claim that everything is relative, not absolute. Even relativists believe in moral absolutes when they feel they have been treated unfairly or immorally. You steal my purse, my wallet, you sleep with my spouse, you ding my favorite car, I'm going to be outraged even though I claim to hold to a very relativistic viewpoint. Every time. Our reactions reveal we actually believe there is a standard and a right and wrong, and that the people should treat us the way we want them to be treated, the way we want to be treated, based on some objective, higher than every person on the planet's existence, moral standard. So reactions to being treated unfairly reveals the moral law is actually written on every human being's heart. Relativism is ultimately an unlivable existence for anyone. You can't live in an entirely relativistic system. There's no way. You can't pay for gas. You can't pay your electric bill. You can't be employable. You can't show up to work on time. You can't trust that your spouse is going to stay with you for the next moment, because everything is relative. Everything is relative. You have no idea. You can't go to the hospital and trust the doctors to treat you, because everything is relative. Relativism contradicts our reactions and our common sense. And we see that. So sure, you can be in a philosophy class and a student and write all the glorious, wonderful words you want about how everything in the world is relative. Doesn't mean you live by it. Nobody can live by relativism. It simply fails anytime, every time it's applied. So again, reactions help us to identify right and wrong, even as a nation. So we had, 3 years ago, we had a national reaction to 9/11 that reveals certain things are absolutely wrong. You just don't fly planes into buildings to kill innocent people, right? What higher standard do you need to appeal to say that's wrong, all places, all times, all situations? You don't do it. Now, we can, again, talk about motives, and we can talk about how people think that they're doing something, but we can even unpack that. Why did they fly planes into buildings, to the best of our knowledge? Because they thought they were standing up for what their scriptures, whatever their system said. These are infidels, they need to die, and all of that. They were appealing to some standard. It was the wrong standard, but they weren't appealing to, we're just anarchists. We just love killing people. No, it's never like that. It's just we had a purpose. It was misapplied, misunderstood, but it was a purpose. The moral law is not always apparent from our own actions, because we're sinners, because we're immoral. Humans choose to do terrible things all the time. We'd all accept that. But it's usually revealed in our reactions when we see or experience terrible things done to me. Okay? Like I said, the gang member, the hardened criminal and thief. I personally experience it, on the streets of downtown Spokane at times. We have these people who will do all kinds of crime in the downtown corridor, and yet I had to intercede for one of my employees, or one of the employees at the law firm downtown, when a girl walked by his little pile of stuff, a little duffel bag of stuff, and he screamed at her, "If you get any closer to my stuff, I'm going to cut your heart out." Most of it was probably stolen, but he didn't want her stealing from him. It's revealed in what we think something wrong or immoral is going to happen to us, and we have our responses. So the moral law is not always the standard by which we treat others, right? I do things and say things I shouldn't do and say. I'm not the standard by which anybody should live by. But it's almost always the standard by which we expect others to treat us. I can lie and, whatever. I can lie to my wife, lie to my kids, lie to my employer, lie to my church, lie to everybody. But man, do I get upset when somebody lies to me, right? I mean, it gets, I don't just go, well, you're just like me. You're a liar and I'm a liar, so we should never expect to tell the truth. No, I go around, I'm not saying I do, I'm saying as an example, I go around telling all kinds of lies everywhere I go and I never think twice about it. The moment I catch somebody else in a lie, I'm just outraged. Why would you lie to me? I thought you told me you did this. I thought you promised that. I'm outraged. So it's not the standard we hold ourselves to, it's the standard we hold others to treat us with, is typically how we can start to see the evidence of the moral law in operation in our hearts. The moral law does not describe how we actually behave. It prescribes how we ought to behave. There's a big difference between how we behave and how we ought to behave. But we do have this sense that we ought to behave in a certain way. That's the main point. So without the moral law, there could be no human rights. We've kind of talked about that. Or violation of human rights. Back to our founding fathers, the founding fathers believed that the human rights are God-given. So they believed that there is a moral law and there's a moral lawgiver, and they appealed to that when we told the King of England, we won't be under your jurisdiction anymore. They appealed to our Creator to justify their cause because His moral law is unchanging and absolute. The way you treat us is not the way our Creator wants us treated. So we're rejecting you and following Him. That's the Declaration of Independence. So we can know that Hitler and the Nazis' actions were absolutely wrong. And if we know that they're absolutely wrong, then we have to acknowledge there is a moral law. Because otherwise it's just a matter of opinion. We can only detect injustice because we know in our hearts what justice is. Right? We get, if someone murders somebody in our family, we want justice. But how could we even know what justice looks like or what it should be if we don't have some standard by which to appeal to? Someone steals from us, if some nation attacks us at Pearl Harbor or at 9/11 or whatever, there's this moral outrage that says we need to respond. We need to deal with this, and it comes from an appeal to a moral standard. And without an objective moral standard, any objection to evil is nothing but a personal opinion. Why? Especially given the materialistic, atheistic, evolutionary claims, why shouldn't the strongest person in this room tonight kill everybody else and take everything you own? That's survival of the fittest, isn't it? Why shouldn't I? Or if I'm not the strongest person, whoever the strongest person is, why shouldn't they take everything you have and then just keep going right down the neighborhood line and getting everything they can? Survival of the fittest. Why have all these weak people in the society when I can just use my strength to go and advance the strongest part of society? Why would we object to any form of evil? Why would we object to some guy walking down, Main Street, downtown Spokane, and raping every woman on the street that he sees? Why would we be outraged by that if there's no moral law? It's a standard, and it's not an opinion. It's not a vote. We all understand within our own being, our own hearts, that there is a standard by which every human being is expected to live by, even if most human beings don't actually do so. We intuitively know that someone's taste in food, let's say I like chocolate, you like vanilla, is not categorically the same thing as having a preference for good versus evil. Categorically different. It's okay that some people like chocolate and other people like vanilla. It's not okay that some people like to do evil and other people would prefer they do good. There has to be a difference, a quantitative, qualitative difference between good and evil versus just mere human preference for certain things and certain actions. Without a moral law, we could not even detect injustice of any kind. How could we even know that murder's wrong, that stealing's wrong, that adultery's wrong, rape is wrong, if we don't have some sense of what is right? We don't even have to observe it. You can just know in your heart. You could grow up in a tribe in Africa or in Asia or somewhere out in the sticks, wherever, and you'll still understand the moral law, even if no one in your tribe practices it. You'll still have a sense of this right versus wrong, because every human being has it. Without justice, injustice is meaningless. Right? Committing what we call crime or immoral act or injustice, it's meaningless if there's not a such thing as justice. So, because we know the moral, since we can identify in our own lives, we can look around and say, ask yourself in your entire life's existence, I've never ever once seen evil. Never ever once said that's evil. Some action, terrorism, murder on the streets, something your family member did to you, something whatever, you classify that as evil. If you know evil exists, then you're by default stating that you know a moral law exists, because you're making an appeal to something outside of yourself that says, I know what's right and I know what's wrong, and it doesn't come from my thoughts. It comes from something within me that's not just a thought. a preference or an opinion. So without the moral law, there'd be no way to measure moral differences. If your moral ideas can be truer than someone else's, like the Nazis, then there must be something, some real morality for them to be true about. This is pulling from C.S. Lewis. We'll talk about that probably next week. Moral claims must be based on a real moral law. So again, murder is evil, racism is wrong, child abuse is wrong. None of these claims can be made if there's not an actual standard by which we're making an appeal to. Anybody disagree that murder is evil? That racism at its core is wrong? Whether it's old version or new version of racism, racism is wrong. Child abuse is wrong. These standards are clearly not matters, again, of personal opinion. The universal, unchanging moral standard must be based on a moral law, which is not invented by man, it's only discovered by man. Right? We discover truth. We don't invent it, we discover it. We're recognizing there's an unchanging human standard for morality, and the source of that must be a moral law, and it must have been written on our hearts, because we don't need to appeal to any text, religious or otherwise, to understand that there are rights and there are wrong things and right things, there are evil things and good things, and we recognize that from our own conscience and our own internal being. So we can't know right and wrong without the moral law. And attempts to deny that we can know right versus wrong fail anytime or another a relativist asserts that something is in fact wrong in their view. The moment the relativist, like the student getting an F on his paper for no good reason, asserts that's wrong, he's immediately appealing to a standard that says there actually is a standard of right and wrong. There actually is a moral law. Every negation, declaring something to be wrong, implies an affirmation that there is something, or there must be something right against an unchanging standard. Right? Every time you claim something is wrong, that you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't steal from me. You shouldn't lie to me. You shouldn't rape my wife. You shouldn't kill my family. You shouldn't do all these things. Any negation or appeal to something being wrong is, when you flip the coin over, it's an affirmation that it really must be something that's right in comparison. So some claim that there's no such thing as right or wrong. We've seen that. There's no such thing as truth, and there's no such thing as right or wrong. Of course, it's self-defeating in this claim that there's no such thing as right or wrong, because they will demand that any opposition to their standard is wrong. Right? There's no such thing as right or wrong. You can't tell me there's a such thing as right or wrong. Well, I'm telling you you're wrong. What are they going to do? They're going to get outraged that you don't agree with them. Well, why does it matter? But they're going to be outraged because you're going to say, no, I believe there really is a standard. And they're going to be outraged. But why are you outraged? You told me there's no standard. Immediately they're trying to convince you should think like they do. And the moment they step outside of the relativistic thinking, they're claiming they need you to accept an absolute truth. Their absolute truth, but they're belying their own ignorance of their own, faulty position with the moment they appeal to a standard that they want you to adopt. Without a moral law, there is no moral ground for political social sin. Are we already doing this one? By rebelling against the moral law, atheists have ironically undermined the very grounds for rebelling against anything. We love to rebel. We love to tear down everything that has ever stood in our culture and everything else. But when we tear these things down and they're rebelling, well, they're doing it because they're appealing to some standard. They say, it's wrong, I have the right to tear down a statue of Abraham Lincoln or whatever, right? And the appealing to some standard, they feel that they have the moral right to do so. We know that issues involving life and liberty are more than just preferences. They involve real moral rights. Again, a claim the moral law does exist. Making excuses for bad behavior is again, an omission of the moral law. So why should anyone have to be tolerant of bad behavior without a moral law? Right? This isn't so much as prevalent as maybe when the book was written 22 years ago or whatever it was. But we hear the screaming all around. You need to be tolerant. You need to tolerate other people's views. Tolerant, 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 tolerant. Why should anybody have to tolerate bad behavior? Bad behavior is just as good as good behavior if there's no standard, right? So why are we encouraged to tolerate, immoral and anarchist type positions? Behavior is just behavior. It means nothing. If there's no good or bad, there's just behavior. But they scream tolerance. You need to tolerate this and that and the other thing. Why? Because there's a standard they're asking you to appeal to. The moral law exceeds the demands for tolerance and commands that we demonstrate love for others, not just tolerate them. There's a big difference. Moral law doesn't say tolerate people, it says love people. And many times, loving people isn't loving them enough to tell them the truth, to tell them they're sinning against a creator, they're violating a moral standard, whatever it may be. And in other ways, it may just be love them and accept them. But we notice how the moral law goes above these cultural claims that we just need to tolerate people's lifestyles or opinions or whatever else. The moral law says love them, not just tolerate them. You don't need to plead with people to tolerate good moral behavior, do you? Do you have to tolerate somebody saying, "Let me get the door for you"? "Oh, you take my seat, I'll get another one," right? Do we have to do we consider that tolerating people being really good to us, or do we have to tolerate bad behavior? Why did you cut me off? Why did you move my stuff? Why did whatever it is? It's always, we see it as bad behavior and we question it. But boy, somebody says, "Thank you for being so helpful to me yesterday." I can't believe I have to tolerate their being so grateful to me. Is that how we respond? No, we're never asked or ever feel this need to tolerate good stuff. It's always the bad stuff, and that's always the appeal to tolerating. What's that? I've run into people who, there's some people who don't like to be complimented, and you run into people who don't want the door open. But it usually comes from you're trying to put me in a submissive role in some capacity, right? So they feel a moral outrage to your action, even though it was kind. They viewed it as unkind, and therefore they're appealing to a same standard again, right? All right. So this is important. We'll cover this even more so in C.S. Lewis stuff. But what people actually do changes, but what they ought to do does not change. We'll cover this in a little bit more detail in a second. But relativists confuse what people are doing with what they ought to do. Okay? Difference between what people are doing versus what they ought to do. So, and this also comes from C.S. Lewis, so he talks about, was there some great moral advance in not executing witches anymore? Well, executing witches who cannot cast a murderous spell is wrong, right? So somebody claims to be a witch, and they're saying, "Well, I'm going to cast a spell on this whole town, and everybody's going to die." Well, if there's no such thing as witches and witchcraft, and the spells will have no power, then executing people because they think they're a witch and they have power they don't have would be wrong. But punishing actual murders is not wrong. So if the witches actually had power to kill people by their spells, then putting them to death would be the morally correct thing to do, right? So the point is, people will say, "Well, you people used to, put witches in stockades or behead them or whatever you did with the witches," right? And so the claim is, well, so the moral standards of the culture have changed. No, not really. Not really. Murderers should be dealt with as murderers. Okay? But realizing that somebody's faulty view of their power or some kind of whatever says, "Well, you're just crazy. We don't have to put you to death for your spells. We might have to put you into a psychiatric ward, but we don't need to put you to death for attempting to murder people with a couple of potions that you're mixing together in a pot," right? But if you're actually mixing potions together in a pot and killing people, then we need to deal with it because it's a violation of the moral law. Okay, so not putting witches to death is not an advancement in a moral law. It's just an application of, okay, we understand witches have no power, so we're not putting them to death anymore. Okay, and then we talk about, like, in certain cultures, eating cows or whatever, in reincarnation. Eating cows is not morally wrong. But if you eat a cow that you thought was grandma reincarnated, that would be a moral outrage, wouldn't it? Right? So it's not, again, cultural changes and differences are still appealing to the same standard. They're just different applications of the facts, right? So if grandma really does die and reincarnate herself into a cow, it would be considered murder to kill the cow. But eating cows that are not former humans is not murder. It's just good food, right? So it's not an immoral action. Both of these examples, we're dealing with not killing witches that aren't killing people and not eating cows that aren't grandma. Both of these examples uphold the same moral code, which regard murder as a violation of the moral law. There's no change or advancement in the application of the standard from culture to culture. It's always the same. It's just a different understanding of what might be happening in those cultures. Absolute morals versus situational ethics. Okay, we've all heard of situational ethics. I mean, in the 21st century, we probably all heard situational ethics. Well, in this case, you're allowed to sleep with your secretary, but over here, you're not allowed to sleep with your secretary. Right, as if there's some situational ethic or something that's applied. Again, faulty thinking. Absolute moral versus situational ethics. The absolute moral law exists even if people fail to properly apply it. It's always the case. Even if no one appeals to it, even if no one obeys it, the absolute moral law exists even if people fail to apply it properly. Life always has value. And the moral law always affirms that life has innate value. Human life, specifically, right? So, Hitler, Islam, Roman Catholics, and countless others have had to first dehumanize people in their ideology in order to justify murdering them. In order to do so, they were actually affirming the existence of the moral law that prohibits murder. So, we talked about Hitler to start with. He's part of the title of the chapter, right? What did Hitler have to do? Well, first off, he was very much bought into the Darwinian evolution thing. Darwin himself classified people into lower and higher people groups, and he said, the Africans are more closer to the apes, and eventually we'll kill them all off, right? This is what Darwin was proposing. And Hitler took those ideas of Darwin, just in theoretical viewpoints, and said, hey, we really see the human race advancing towards something, and we need to shed what it came from because we'll be a better society if we get rid of him. So we'll go to the Aryan race, and we'll look for blonde-haired, blue-eyed whatevers, right, these Aryans, and we'll start murdering everybody else. So what did he do? He's dehumanizing, beginning with the Jews, and saying they're subhuman. So I have every right to kill them and exterminate them because they're subhuman. If Hitler really thought they were the same exact value as himself or all others on the planet, he couldn't have killed tens of millions of them. He had to dehumanize them for his own moral standard and the moral standards of the SS or Nazis or whatever for them to do that. And he's not the only one. As I said, with flying planes in the buildings, Islam had to do the same thing. We're in the right, and we have all these infidels, and we have every right to kill infidels. So infidels were being dehumanized. What happens in almost every war? I don't want to use pejorative terms, but whether it's Japanese or Koreans or Germans or whatever, we come up with some name that's very pejorative against them and vilify them, and then it doesn't feel so bad to kill them. If we really thought they were fully at the same level of humanity as we are, we have a much harder time killing them. The same thing with Catholics, Roman Catholics, and they also attacked the Jews well before Hitler did, okay, with the Crusades and all of that. And what did they have to do? Well, they started calling the Jews Jesus killers, and they started killing even Jewish babies, having contests to see how many Jewish babies they could put on a spear. They're dehumanizing a part of the human race to justify their actions. What does that tell you about the moral law? If you don't first dehumanize, your own conscience tells you, I can't do this action. So, consider every single war, certainly that America has been in, or any of these other examples, and you'll find the dehumanizing of the people, especially if we're talking about the initiators of it, like Hitler and the Jews, right? Dehumanize and kill. We go off and fight the Germans and the Japanese, and we say they attacked us, so we have every right to defend ourselves, but we still, because it's so hard to kill another human being and not feel that moral conviction, we come up with a term to dehumanize them even in that role. Okay, it's just the human nature, because the moral law exists, and it convicts us strongly against these improper actions. And the same thing could be true of a husband murdering his wife, right? He's got to call her the enemy. She's the worst thing that's ever happened to me. She's evil. She's wicked. She's X, Y, Z. Right? It's almost always the case. They feel a moral justification for taking this murderous action because they've, in a sense, in their mind and their heart, dehumanized their victim. And you see all that with all the crime shows and whatever. Some very messed up mass murderer, serial killer, whatever, who has a thing against women or prostitutes or whatever, and then he goes off and kills them. He's justifying in his actions, I have every right to do that. Not that some people do not truly have a seared conscience, and some people have zero capacity to truly understand right and wrong. But most people who still have a moral standard, because they're not genetically or whatever, or chemically from drugs and stuff impacted by it, they have to dehumanize to involve some level of these actions. So in doing so, they were actually affirming the existence of the moral law that prohibits murder in every one of those cases. If only one single moral obligation can be proven to exist, like murder's wrong, rape is wrong, torture's wrong, child abuse is wrong, then the moral law is confirmed by our collective conscience. All people at all time. 8 billion people on the planet today, and however many billions of people have lived in the 6,000 years since we've got here, that's all testifies to a existence of a singular moral law in our culture. Okay? And so that's how we begin to start to come to a true understanding. Yes, we have a moral law. Yes, it's not an opinion. It's not a preference. It didn't come from chemicals all bonding together in some gooey environment. There actually is a standard, and there actually is a standard that exists above and beyond and far and outlives and outweighs all human thought process. Therefore, we're starting to find the moral law must come from something outside of humanity. And so with that, we'll take our break. All right, we can jump back in. All right, so we're still, obviously deep here in the moral law. This is a summary chapter. As I always said, the C.S. Lewis version of the book, or of this whole topic, is much deeper, much richer, really explains a lot of things. We'll cover some of that next week, or that big section of that next week. But anyway, through trying to get through this chapter 7 of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, we'll keep moving through here on this point. So, absolute command versus relative culture. We'll just kind of compare and contrast. Again, trying to help us understand, is there truly this existence? Does it, remember the syllogism, right? Every law has a lawgiver. There really is a moral law, therefore there's a moral lawgiver. We're trying to figure out, by evidential experience, understanding and exploration, is there really a moral law? Okay, so we're going to kind of compare an absolute commands or moral law versus a relative culture that applies things in a relative sense. We're dealing with differences between like what versus how. What would be, is there a moral law, and how is how people or societies or nations deal with things. Okay, so the what versus how confirms rather than denies the moral law, like treating strangers with kindness, right? Is it right or wrong? People would make this claim, well, some people will treat strangers with kindness is part of a cultural thing, right? As opposed to a moral law. It's just, there's applicational differences here that we should explore. And I think this helps as we go a little bit further. The moral law is the claim is the moral law is absolute. How it's practiced by people and societies is relative. And we see the authors try to deal with this. Like, in the concept of right to life versus right to liberty. Okay, most people will say, there's like right to life versus right to liberty. Well, these have some tensions. I have freedom. Why does this right trump that right? How can we distinguish between my right to make my own choices for myself versus you saying I don't have the right to do something with my own body or whatever else, the right to life versus right to liberty? There's got to be some, if these societal tensions and arguments and debates are going on, we've got to have something that helps to make the appeal. But it's not really a distinction in this, just like we looked at with dehumanizing people. What does, let's say, the right to abortion do with life in the womb? They dehumanize it, right? They call it a fetus, not a baby, right? They're doing everything they can through terminology and definitions and all of that to say, no, it doesn't have the right to life. If it had the right to live, then we wouldn't have our liberties to take its life away from it. So we're going to dehumanize it. We're going to call it a blastocyst or something, and we're going to call it an embryo, and we're going to call it all these things and make it claim, well, it's not yet life. If we define life at fertilization, then we have no right to take it. There is no liberty because it's life, and it's simply we recognize we don't. My liberty to, in this room again, we can go back to it. I stand up and say, I want the right to liberty. I want to have the right to do anything I want. Does that mean I can kill everybody in the room? Right? No, it doesn't, because the right to life trumps the right to liberty in that debate or in that disagreement about which one has the higher moral value. So the controversy is over which value holds the higher moral obligation. We don't deny a right to liberty. We deny that the right to liberty has the right to take someone else's right to life. Okay, which one has the higher moral obligation? Suppressing the moral law by improper interpretation doesn't invalidate the law. So we can use that debate for the moment. Okay, the debate is over when do we define the beginning of life. Okay, its application, but the moment we say it's alive, we recognize that the right to life has a higher moral standard. So we're not invalidating it. We're just debating over when it begins. Okay, it seems like the moral standard would say Wherever there's a doubt, wherever there's a question, you move it as far back in the process as you possibly can, because we don't want to get this one wrong. I mean, everybody talks about, the death penalty and murders and all that kind of stuff, and, we want to make sure we get it right. We want to make sure we get it right, make sure we get it right. We don't want to execute somebody who's innocent, but then we have completely different standards when it comes to the unborn arguments that happen there. So people kind of differ, wrestle with this whole subject on the concept of absolute ends, means the values, and the relative means, how you get there, how it's applied. Okay? Helping the poor is a value. Everybody would say it's an obligation on a person or society to help the poor. The means of helping the poor reveals relative viewpoints on how it should be done, does it not? Traditional Democrat, Republican kind of approaches. Democrats are, we need to redistribute wealth, and Republicans are maybe more like, we need to increase opportunities. We think the end result, the moral value is we want to help bring people out of poverty. Okay? The approaches are different. The standard is the same. So in most of these moral debates, we're not arguing about the need for absolute moral standards to be observed. We're arguing about what's the best way to get it done. Okay? And there might be some moral implications of that. I think there are. Robbing from the rich and giving to the poor is maybe not the most moral thing to do. Helping the poor to become better at what, to get up out of those situations might be the more moral thing to do. It might be more God-honoring thing to do and human-honoring thing to do. But that's politics. We're talking about a single moral standard that exists regardless of how you would get there from a means. Yeah. Oh. Sorry. Yeah, right. No, I understand that. But I mean, what I'm saying, just the application. So people would want to claim there's no morals because look, you people are constantly arguing. You need to redistribute wealth, or you need to increase opportunity, or whatever. And they want to claim there's no moral standard. The point is there is a moral standard. There's different means of how it might be accomplished. Okay. And those different means may have different moral implications just within themselves, but that appeal is, in the sense of helping the poor, is a real moral obligation. You don't just let the poor be poor. You do something as a person individually, or you do something as a society to see if the poor can be, fed and clothed and helped in some capacity. But people have very different ways of suggesting we help the poor. Okay. Peace is a value. I think we all recognize peace is better than war, right? But how you achieve peace is obviously a very relative viewpoint. Some people say peace through passivity. And some people like Reagan or whoever else has gone after him have said peace through strength. Everybody wants peace. Do we get there through passivity, or do we get there through strength? Those are questions about application. The value, peace is better than war, is truly a value. Hope you see those distinctions, right? That's why we're trying to, as best as we can, make a distinction, because people oftentimes don't get down to the root. They just deal with surface level stuff, and they don't see that there's actually something that can be unified between the two views. The two views are, we want to help the poor. Republicans, I'm not trying to endorse whatever, just simply saying Republicans are, called, cold-hearted and mean-spirited and blah, 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 because they don't want to just give money out, or well, they probably do anymore. But, there's this sense of, no, they're saying, no, we want to help, but you're not understanding how we want to help, right? It's difference in application. So, let's go back to this concept we opened with the Darwinists, what they have to say about their scientific claims. Let's look at what they have to say about their moral standards. Okay. Darwinists claim that only matter or materials exist. But material things don't have inherent moral standards, right? Your car in the driveway doesn't have a moral standard. Okay. chemicals in a laboratory have no moral standards. Okay, they don't have any kind of that. But we can, and they can offer material things can offer no explanation or justification for objective morality. Material. So morality is not merely an instinct. We need to deal with this, and again, C.S. Lewis really deals with the concept that morality is not an instinct. We'll touch on it here. We'll get more depth on that next week when we start the C.S. Lewis stuff. And some of this is from C.S. Lewis, but morality is not merely just an instinct. So we have multiple competing instincts that must be arbitrated in between things. Okay. And so something in us, so for example, something in us tells us to ignore a stronger instinct in order to do something more noble for others, like laying down our lives in battle. Okay, so like C.S. Lewis talks about, let's talk about it this way. So you hear someone screaming in a dark alley as you're walking down the street at night. Your first instinct, not moral, your first instinct is, I hope that doesn't happen to me. Maybe I should run for my car. Maybe I should get out of here. This flight or fight kind of response, right? I better deal with this, and so that's it. But then something else that's weaker in you, but has a moral obligation says, I think I need to go help somebody. I need to get on the phone and call the police. I need to walk down the alley. I need to get my flashlight out. I need to get my trusty weapon out, whatever it is. Somehow we've got to say, my desire to run and stay safe has got to be suppressed. That's an instinct. And my desire to see someone help in the time of need is also an instinct, but I don't want to myself get injured, so I have to somehow suppress the stronger instinct and encourage the weaker instinct, because the weaker instinct is the more moral, correct choice to make. Okay? So in any situation, we might find that. We might have the same thing with somebody drowning. You're driving your car by the road, you see somebody in a lake and they're screaming and drowning, and you say, wow, I could try to help them, but if I jump in that same water and it's 34 degrees, I could be just as close to death as they are. How can I help them? I need to save my life, but I don't want to see them die. And so you have these two instincts, and you have to debate between how you're going to help versus whether or not you're going to stay safe. And those are just examples of trying to separate instinct from an instinct driving us towards a moral decision. Social morals could not have evolved. That's a claim. Blind naturalistic forces could not be used to explain higher purposes like survival of the species through moral acts. We can explain how animals around the globe can engage in survival of the fittest. A lion doesn't care whatsoever how many gazelles it takes down and eats. It's got no moral desire to change any of its behaviors. If it's hungry, it seeks, it kills, it eats. Right? But survival of the human species seems to not be predicated on getting power over everyone else to my advantage and harming society as a whole. Something different about that. Darwinists assume survival is a good thing, but nothing can be objectively good without a moral law to tell you what's good versus bad. So anytime Darwinists claim, well, this is good for the species, this is good, this is how we're going to survive, they're assuming surviving is good. They're assuming that the actions, instinctive or otherwise, are good if it leads to the survival of the species. But why is it good? Why, and that also begs certain questions like, why do we care if the dodo bird is extinct? Why do we care if the California condors are going to say, isn't that just survival of the fittest doing its thing? Why do we care? That's what nature should be doing, killing off the weak and supporting the strong. But somehow we get involved in all of these, save the condors and all this, and I'm not saying those are wrong. But why are they objectively a moral thing to do versus just observing that we live in this survival of the fittest, kill or be killed type existence? Yeah. Right. Yeah, well, if it started by natural courses, just let it burn the whole country down. Where do we have to appeal to some kind of objective standard if we're going to survive as a society. And it can't just be people's opinions. It's got to be something higher than that. So Darwin is confused with, the claim here is that Darwin is confused how we come to acknowledge the moral law with the moral law itself. Okay? The moral law in nature exists regardless of how we come to discover them. Morality exists independent from how each person comes to know it. You can know it through reading the Bible. You can come to by observation of your parents and grandparents. You can come to it just because your own inner voice is telling you, I don't have the right to take that person's money or that person's wife or that person's life. Okay. Darwinists could not explain why anyone should abide by any moral sentiment if it doesn't come from God. Okay? So why would an atheist, a moralistic, or an atheistic, Darwinist, evolutionist, whatever we want to call them, why would they claim anything shouldn't be done? You shouldn't engage in racism. You shouldn't engage in rape. You shouldn't engage in murder. Why shouldn't it happen? Not just, well, that's not really helpful to society and blah, 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 blah. Morally, why shouldn't it happen? There's no standard they can appeal to if there's not something that exists outside of and above all human beings at all times. And then we again say ideas have consequences. We talked about Hitler already. Hitler believed Darwin and believed that certain human races had no inherent rights to exist, so he murdered millions of innocent human beings based on his faulty and immoral philosophy. Racism and genocide are logical outworkings of Darwinism, and we've seen this. The 20th century has tens and tens of millions of people killed by tyrannical leaders who were Darwinian. Hardcore, full card-carrying Darwinists, because they believed that there was no, that they had every moral right to do so in the sense of we've dehumanized so we can kill. And accepting God and his moral law should result in love and sacrifice because we can and do recognize the existence of the moral law. Love and self-sacrifice are good things, and these are consistent with the moral law. There's no reason for them if there's not a moral law to appeal to. Darwinists, as I keep alluding to here, Darwinists can only consider rape, murder, and torture, genocide, whatever else you want to call it, and other forms of evil as a personal dislike. They can't call it morally wrong. Because if we got here through the goo in the zoo, and there's absolutely no moral lawgiver, and there's nothing out there, then it's a matter of personal preferences and likes and dislikes. It's not an absolute standard to appeal to. But no one ever seems to claim that it's not an absolute standard. They just claim that certain people are obeying it according to their liking, and some people aren't. So when Darwinists make moral assertions, not arguments, right? But we see this all the time. Darwinists make moral assertions. They're not making logical arguments that are based on their own viewpoints of materialism. They have eliminated the possibility of a moral lawgiver from their worldview, so all they can do is offer an assertion or a plea that please observe our moral preferences. That's all they can do is please obey it. We have no reason or basis by which to make the claim because it's just a preference as opposed to a moral law and an accountability to a moral law giver. All right, Darwinists claim that all behaviors are genetically determined. So again, they're claiming everything is genetically determined. So a murderer is genetically predisposed to be a murderer. A rapist is genetically predisposed to be a rapist. And all of their attacks on human beings is just a natural phenomenon, and we shouldn't judge them as right or wrong. If a murderer was built to be a murderer, why shouldn't he murder? If a rapist was designed from his internal being to be a rapist, why shouldn't he do what he was designed to do? I mean, they're saying that all of their behaviors are genetically determined, and there is no moral standard by which to appeal to. So it would actually be inconsistent. It would be wrong, in a Darwinian view, to tell a murderer not to murder. They were programmed by their DNA that came about by randomness and chance to do that. telling them not to do what they were designed to do would be wrong in this standard. You see why we need to have a higher moral standard, not just a individualistic preference standard. But the assertion is consistent with their worldviews. I mean, that you're just doing what you were designed to do. In the final analysis, morality without a moral lawgiver is just another just so story, as we like to say. It's just so. Why should people obey a moral law? Well, just because we asked you to. There's no reason in the atheistic worldview to appeal to anything that someone should say, oh, I have an obligation to obey that, rather than I can choose to obey it or not. It's my preference. It is clearly unreasonable to believe that generally accepted moral principles arose from nothing, or as a preference that some people have. If they have no divine source, that they can and will change along with every other human preference. We'll get to a point where we start to advance ourselves through society where murder, rape, and torture, and child abuse, and all these things are considered good. I mean, that's the trajectory of society if we have ever-changing moral standards or applications of moral standards. Okay. Anybody have any thoughts or questions? Again, this is what I consider to be the first stage of the concept of the moral law. I think you'll really be blessed by seeing how C.S. Lewis really treats it next week. And he really just had a super sharp mind to deal with these kind of philosophical and logical processes. And so we'll look at that next week. But anybody have any thoughts, questions on this stuff tonight?
I just think the fact that anybody can have their own truth
Yeah.
is an indication of how far
Yeah, we are.
and what's up and down is up and
Right.
all of that. And
Yeah. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, right? That's Isaiah talks about that.
absolutely going in the wrong direction.
Right. Anybody else? If you want to stick around, I want to show like an 8-minute video. This is on, and I'm going to turn the stream off here in a moment, but this is basically, if you've eaten lunch or dinner or breakfast today, I want to show you what your body needs to do chemically for that to happen from a DNA perspective. Okay, so I'm going to go turn the video off, and if you want to stick around, please. Bye-bye to our live stream folks.